The first light of morning crept over the restless city, painting the sky with shades of amber and rose. Beneath the cracked and weathered arches of the bridge, life stirred in fragments, muted footsteps, the shuffle of traders carrying baskets, and the faint hum of a city that never truly slept. The world above pulsed with wealth and noise, yet down here, shadows stretched longer, and survival took on a different rhythm. Adana adjusted the fraying strap of her worn bag, its weight digging into her small shoulder. Inside, a few stale bread rolls lay carefully wrapped in old paper, treasures she had gathered through persistence more than luck. Her bare feet pressed into the dust, tracing the same paths she walked each day, etched deep into her memory. She had grown used to mornings like this, waking not to comfort but to duty. Her mother's cough echoed in her mind, a fragile reminder of why she carried herself through the aching fatigue. The woman who once held the strength of two now lay fragile and fading, the sickness stealing more from her each day. Adana was only a child, yet the weight of the world pressed down on her as though she were carved from stone. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharp and unforgiving, but she silenced it with determination. Every roll of bread was not for her lips, but for the woman waiting under the bridge, whose eyes still carried warmth despite the shadows of illness. The bridge above rumbled as cars passed, the sound like thunder rolling through the air. Adana barely looked up anymore. Luxury was a world she knew she could never touch. The glittering glass towers in the distance might as well have been built on another planet, unreachable to someone whose dreams were measured in crumbs of bread and fleeting moments of kindness. Yet she did not allow despair to choke her. Each day was a battle, a test of resilience. She told herself stories as she walked, tales of strength, of children who rose from dust and grew into something unbreakable. Stories were her shield, invisible but powerful. As the sun rose higher, light filtered through cracks in the broken concrete, scattering golden patches onto her skin. She paused for a moment, letting the warmth sink in. Dust swirled gently around, her ankles catching the glow like sparks from an unseen fire. In that instant, she looked less like a weary child of the streets and more like a figure touched by some hidden grace. Life was cruel, yes, but it had not stolen her spirit. The morning whispered promises only she could hear, that the day might yet hold something different, that perhaps destiny would not always be written in hunger and struggle. With her basket clutched tightly, Adana pushed forward, her thin legs carrying her toward another uncertain day, guided only by hope and necessity. Adana's footsteps slowed as she approached the hidden corner where her mother rested. The bridge's underbelly was a place of echoes, distant laughter, muffled shouts, and the occasional roar of an engine overhead. But in the quietest corner, behind discarded crates and torn tarpaulin, lay the fragile figure who had once been the center of Adana's small world. Her mother's face, once radiant and alive with strength, now carried the pale hue of weakness. Each cough rattled through her chest, sharp and hollow, as though her body fought battles it no longer had the strength to win. "Ma," Adana whispered softly, crouching beside her. She unwrapped the paper and held out one of the bread rolls, careful not to show how badly she wanted one herself. The older woman's hands trembled as she reached, her fingers brushing against her daughter's before closing weakly around the food. She forced a faint smile, one that tried to hide the truth but could not mask the exhaustion in her eyes. "You haven't eaten," her mother rasped, breaking the bread in half. She extended the smaller piece toward Adana, but the girl shook her head quickly. "I'm not hungry," Adana lied, her own stomach twisting violently at the smell of the bread. She pressed her lips into a determined line, willing herself not to give in. Hunger had become a silent companion, but love was louder. She watched her mother nibble slowly, every bite an act of survival, every swallow a defiance against the sickness clinging to her. Adana leaned back against the cold stone of the bridge, closing her eyes for a moment. The world outside felt so far away, as if she lived in a forgotten pocket of the city where dreams rarely strayed. But even here, in this hidden space, her heart carried flickers of hope. She thought of schoolchildren she sometimes watched from afar, dressed in neat uniforms with bags heavier than her own, filled with books instead of stale bread. She envied them, yes, but more than that, she longed to be among them, to hold a pencil and shape letters on paper, to learn something that might build a future stronger than her present. Her mother's voice, soft and broken, pulled her back. "One day, Adana, you'll leave this place. You'll rise above it all. I know it." Adana nodded, though the certainty in her mother's tone felt heavier than her own belief. The bridge loomed above them like a barrier, but she clung to the possibility that it might one day crumble. She studied her mother's face, committing it to memory, the way her tired eyes still held a spark, the way her lips curved in reassurance, despite the pain. These were the pieces of love that stitched Adana's strength together, thread by fragile thread. As the morning stretched on, Adana rose to her feet once more. The day had only begun, and there were still errands to run, still battles to face. She adjusted the strap of her bag, kissed her mother's forehead gently, and stepped back into the dusty light. The city was waiting, indifferent, yet demanding. Adana took a deep breath, tightened her grip on hope, and walked toward whatever the hours ahead might bring. The streets were already alive when Adana emerged once more into the world above. Vendors called out their prices, balancing trays of fruit or bowls of steaming food on their heads, while buyers haggled loudly, their hands slicing through the air in practiced gestures. The scent of roasted corn and spicy stew filled the atmosphere, making her empty stomach twist and groan. Children ran past her with bursts of laughter, their bare feet smacking against the dusty ground as they chased one another through the crowded lanes. For a fleeting second, Adana wanted to follow them, to forget the weight of her basket and join in the careless joy. But reality anchored her. She could not afford the luxury of play. She weaved through the chaos with a quiet determination, her basket pressed tightly against her chest, as though it contained jewels instead of scraps of bread. The people around her hardly noticed. Most were too consumed with their own struggles. Still, she felt the sting of being invisible, of existing in a city that valued only wealth and beauty, while ignoring the ones who slipped between the cracks. She glanced up at the towering billboards overhead, images of glamorous faces, advertising things she could never buy. Clothes, cars, perfumes that promised a life of elegance. The glossy smiles seemed to mock her hunger. Everywhere she looked, contrasts screamed at her. A sleek black car slid through the street, its tinted windows shutting out the noise of poverty, while beside it a beggar crouched in the dirt, palm outstretched. Adana tightened her grip on her basket and kept walking. She knew too well which side of the line she belonged to. Yet deep in her chest, a stubborn ember burned, an unwillingness to believe she was destined to stay there forever. She paused at a corner where the morning sun fell across a broken wall, its surface covered with bright graffiti. The colors seemed almost alive, shapes of birds taking flight, words scrawled in bold letters she couldn't yet read. Still, she stared at it, imagining the meaning. To her, the painted wings whispered of freedom, of escape beyond the suffocating streets. She closed her eyes and let herself dream, just for a moment, that she too could rise above it all, her thin legs carrying her somewhere no hunger could follow. But dreams alone did not fill stomachs. A sharp voice snapped her back to reality as a trader shouted, warning her to move aside. She stumbled back, clutching her basket tightly as the man pushed past with his goods. The humiliation burned, but Adana swallowed it, knowing that pride was a luxury she could not afford. Her life was measured in endurance, in the quiet strength of standing back up, no matter how many times the world shoved her down. With the noise of the market echoing in her ears, she took a slow breath and continued forward. Every step was heavy with responsibility, but her spirit carried her onward. The city was harsh, yes, but she refused to let it break her. Somewhere within the dust and shadows she believed A different path waited for her, a path she had yet to find, but one she would not stop searching for. The sun climbed higher, washing the city in a heat that pressed heavily against the skin. Adana wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, her small frame moving steadily along the dusty path. Each corner of the streets held its own story: children balancing water jugs, women bargaining fiercely over vegetables, men calling out to advertise their wares. To many, it was simply the rhythm of daily survival. But to Adana, it was a reminder of how small she was in a world that rarely noticed her existence. Still, she walked with quiet strength, as though her feet knew a destination beyond what her eyes could see. Passing by a row of shops, her gaze lingered on a group of schoolchildren spilling out of a classroom. Their neat uniforms gleamed, crisp, white shirts tucked into pressed trousers, skirts swaying neatly as they moved together. Their voices rose in chatter, laughter weaving into the warm air. Adana slowed her pace, her heart tugging painfully at the sight. She longed to join them, to sit at a desk with books laid out before her, to listen to a teacher's voice guiding her into a world beyond the bridge and the streets. Knowledge felt to her like a locked treasure chest, and she stood without a key. A pang of envy coursed through her, but it was not the kind that poisoned. It was the kind that fueled. She wanted more, not for selfishness, but for survival, for her mother, for the fragile hope that tomorrow could be better than today. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her bag, as if clutching not just bread, but a promise she intended to keep. The voices of the children faded behind her as she pressed on. Ahead, the street opened wider, where polished cars glided past like predators among the dust. Their glossy surfaces reflected the sunlight, and through their tinted windows, faces appeared for the briefest moments. Faces untouched by hardship, dressed in elegance, eyes that never glanced down to notice a girl like Adana. Yet she noticed them, and the sharp contrast carved another mark on her heart. There were two worlds here, existing side by side, yet divided by an invisible wall she had no way of crossing. And then, just as she turned the corner, her steps faltered. A sleek black Rolls-Royce slid slowly beneath the very bridge she had left behind. Its presence was almost unreal, a creature of another realm entering hers. The car's surface shone like a mirror, catching the light in a way that made the dust around it shimmer. People nearby paused to stare, some with awe, others with suspicion. Adana stood frozen, her eyes wide, as though the universe had shifted, for a moment, and placed a symbol directly in her path. She did not know what it meant. Was it a reminder of what she lacked, or a glimpse of what might one day be possible? Her heart pounded as the car rolled forward, smooth and silent, disappearing into the maze of the city. Adana exhaled slowly, her breath trembling. Something inside her had stirred, a whisper she couldn't yet name. She shook herself back to focus, clutching her basket once more. The world was calling her forward, and she had no choice but to follow. Adana's feet carried her into the busier heart of the city, where the crowd thickened and the sounds grew louder. Horns blared, motorbikes weaved recklessly through tight spaces, and street vendors shouted over one another, each voice battling for attention. The air was thick with dust and exhaust, a sharp contrast to the faint sweetness of roasted corn and fried plantain drifting from roadside stalls. Her stomach twisted at the smells, but she pressed her lips tightly together, willing herself to stay focused. Hunger was a constant, but she could not let it rule her steps. She stopped at the corner where a cluster of beggars sat with outstretched hands, their eyes tired yet hopeful each time someone passed. Adana glanced at them quietly. She knew their pain too well. Sometimes she felt as though she could see her future in their faces, years of being overlooked, forgotten, worn down by time. But then she thought of her mother's words, the ones spoken with such certainty. One day you'll rise above this, Adana. That belief was what separated her from surrender. She tightened her grip on her basket and forced herself to walk on, though her heart ached for those left behind. As she continued, Her eyes caught sight of a tall building gleaming in the sunlight. Its windows mirrored the world below, creating endless reflections of the people who moved past it. Adana paused, staring at her own reflection for a moment, small, dusty, clothes worn and faded. She lifted her chin, studying herself with quiet determination. The girl looking back at her might appear fragile, but beneath that thin frame was a strength no glass could capture. She whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, "I am more than this." The sound of laughter pulled her attention. A group of well-dressed young women exited the building, their handbags swinging, their jewelry catching the light. They moved with an ease that spoke of comfort, of never wondering where their next meal would come from. Adana stepped aside quickly as they passed, lowering her gaze. She felt invisible, and yet, in her chest, the ember of longing grew hotter. She wanted, not their handbags, not their jewelry, but the freedom that came with their lives. The freedom to dream without the weight of survival pressing against every thought. A sudden shout broke the air as a street boy darted past, clutching a stolen wallet. The crowd erupted, some chasing, others yelling in anger. Adana flinched at the chaos, clutching her basket closer to her chest. For a moment, she imagined herself in the boy's place, desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at survival, but she shook the thought away quickly. That path, she knew, led only to darker shadows. She could not let herself fall there. Her journey stretched on, each step heavy but steady. The world seemed determined to remind her of what she lacked. Yet in every reminder, she also found fuel. She would not surrender. She could not. Somewhere in the distance, hidden beyond the noise and the walls, a future waited for her. And though she did not yet know how to reach it, Adana promised herself she would keep walking until she found the way. The day wore on, and the weight of the sun pressed harder against Adana's shoulders. Her thin dress clung to her back, damp with sweat, yet she moved forward without pause. Around her, the city pulsed with life. Drummers tapping rhythms on overturned buckets, hawkers weaving between cars with trays of water sachets balanced skillfully on their heads, and drivers leaning out of windows to argue and laugh in equal measure. It was chaos, but to Adana it was also a strange kind of music, a beat that seemed to guide her steps. At the edge of a busy junction, she stopped, waiting for the traffic to slow enough for her to cross. Vehicles roared past, their engines coughing, smoke that made her eyes sting. She coughed into her arm, tightening her grip on her basket as if the bread it carried could shield her from the harshness of the world. When the rush finally eased, she darted quickly across, her small legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. On the other side, she paused, catching her breath, the pounding of her heart echoing in her ears. Her eyes lifted to a billboard, towering above the street. On it was the face of a famous actress, smiling with perfect teeth, dressed in clothes that glittered with wealth. The words beside the image promised beauty, power, success, things that felt galaxies away from Adana's reach, and yet, instead of despair, she felt a quiet defiance stir within her. She whispered under her breath, "I will not stay in the shadows forever." Even if the world laughed at her boldness, she knew she had to cling to that vision, because it was the only thing keeping her spirit alive. She moved on, her feet carrying her past shops buzzing with customers. Some glanced at her briefly, most did not notice her at all. To them, she was just another child wandering with a basket, easily dismissed, easily forgotten. But Adana noticed everything. She studied the way money passed from hand to hand, how people bargained, how some voices carried authority while others pleaded. In her mind, she was learning, not in a classroom, but from the streets themselves. Every encounter was a lesson, every insult a test, every kindness a reminder of what still existed in the world. By late afternoon, the heat began to fade, replaced by a softer golden glow. The city's pace shifted, with workers heading home, children trailing behind tired mothers, and the sound of evening prayers beginning to rise in the distance. Adana felt the change in the air, a sense of both ending and beginning. She pressed her basket closer to her chest and walked steadily toward the bridge. Her legs ached, but her resolve did not falter. For all the hardship, for all the hunger and weariness, she carried something the city could not strip away. Hope. It was fragile, yes, but it lived within her like a flame refusing to die. And as long as that flame burned, Adana knew she would keep moving forward, step by step, into whatever tomorrow might bring. The evening light stretched long shadows across the city as Adana made her way back toward the bridge. The streets, once frantic and noisy, began to settle into a slower rhythm. Vendors packed up their goods, sweeping dust into small piles, while the smell of cooking fires drifted through the air. Laughter of children playing with makeshift toys echoed faintly, mixing with the call of traders making their final sales before nightfall. For others, it was the close of a day. For Adana, it was the return to her place of survival. Her feet, though sore, carried her without hesitation. The worn path to the bridge was familiar. Every crack in the ground, every bend in the road felt etched into her memory. As she approached, her eyes fell on the structure that had become her home. Beneath its concrete belly, the shadows deepened, providing shelter from curious eyes. It was not much, but it was where she and her mother clung to each other, day after day, against the world's indifference. Adana slowed as she reached the spot where her mother usually rested. A lump formed in her throat at the sight before her. Her mother lying against a wall, her body fragile, her breaths shallow. The cough had returned, rattling through her chest like a cruel reminder of how fragile life could be. Adana dropped to her knees beside her, placing the basket carefully to the side before touching her mother's arm. "I'm here, Mama," she whispered softly, though the words trembled. Her mother stirred, her eyes fluttering open with effort. A weak smile curved her lips as she reached up to brush a stray lock of hair from Adana's face. "You came back, my strong girl." Adana's chest tightened, but she forced a smile, pulling out a piece of bread from the basket. "I saved this for you. You must eat." She held it out, her hands steady, though her heart felt anything but. Her mother shook her head faintly, her voice low. "You eat first. You need your strength." Tears pricked Adana's eyes, but she knew better than to argue. They had danced this circle too many times, both sacrificing, both refusing, each trying to shield the other from hunger. With determination, she broke the bread into halves, pressing one piece into her mother's hand and taking the other for herself. Together, they ate in silence, the quiet between them heavy with love, fear, and unspoken promises. As the last light faded from the sky, the sound of the city softened into distant hums. Adana leaned against her mother, resting her head on her shoulder. In that closeness, she found strength, even as the uncertainty of tomorrow loomed large. Her eyes lifted toward the darkening sky, where the first stars began to appear, faint and scattered. She whispered into the night, more to herself than to anyone listening. "Someday, I'll give you more than this bridge. Someday, we'll see those stars without fear." The promise hung in the air, fragile yet fierce, carried by the wind as if the universe itself had heard. Night fell fully, wrapping the city in its cloak of darkness. Beneath the bridge, the world grew quieter, though not silent. The distant horns of vehicles, the muffled laughter from nearby streets, and the occasional bark of a stray dog wove together into a soundtrack of survival. For Adana, these sounds had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. They were the rhythm of nights spent here, half asleep, half alert, guarding what little she had. Beside her, her mother rested, her breathing uneven but steady for now. Adana listened closely, every inhale and exhale pulling at her heart. She wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking slightly as the cool night air settled in. Hunger still lingered in her belly, but it was the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest that she felt more sharply. She was only a child. Yet life had demanded she carry burdens far heavier than her years. She tilted her head back, eyes finding the stars that glittered faintly beyond the haze of city smoke. They looked distant, untouchable, like the dreams she carried within her. Still, each star reminded her of possibility, of something brighter than the shadows she lived in. She imagined herself one day stepping into a world where her mother no longer coughed through the night, where bread was not a treasure to ration, where her reflection in glass windows told a story of triumph, not survival. The thought both comforted and frightened her. Dreams were dangerous things in a world like hers. They could lift you up, but they could also break you when reality pressed too hard. Yet Adana could not abandon them. To let go of hope would be to surrender to the darkness, and that she knew she could never allow. As the hours stretched on, a light drizzle began to fall, tapping softly against the concrete. Adana shifted closer to her mother, using the edge of her worn dress to shield her from the dampness. The drops slid down her face like tears, but she held her breath, refusing to cry. Crying, she believed, solved nothing. What mattered was holding on to her mother, to her will, to her stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better. She closed her eyes briefly, letting exhaustion pull at her, but sleep did not come easily. The city's murmurs seeped into her thoughts, carrying with them flashes of the day, the hungry faces she had passed, the glittering billboard, the women laughing in their finery, the boy running with the stolen wallet. Each image reminded her of the world's harsh lines, the divide between those who had everything and those who scraped for every crumb. And somewhere in between, she saw herself, not quite defeated, not yet victorious, but walking steadily through the fire. At last, she whispered into the night, her voice steady though soft. "Tomorrow, I'll try again." It was not a grand vow, not a dramatic declaration, but a simple truth. Because for Adana, survival itself was an act of courage, and every tomorrow carried within it the seed of change. And as she drifted into a light, uneasy sleep beneath the bridge, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if to keep watch over her fragile but unbreakable hope.